everybody. I'm happy that we're able to start on time and that I didn't have any internet problems today. This week's Parsha is Parashat Noach, and according to the title of the Parsha, Noach, in fact, is the central figure in the Parsha. And today I would like to talk about Noach, but I would also like to talk about Nimrod and see the connection between the two. I'll just point out that from the Torah itself, and I would even say not just the Torah, from Midrashim, okay, there does not seem to have been any contact whatsoever between Noach and between Nimrod. So what I'm going to do is not examine their relationship, so to speak, but to examine the parallels, contrasts between Noach and Nimrod. Okay, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that Rashi already, based on a midrash, draws quite a few parallels, contrasts between Noach and Abraham, who appears at the very end of the parsha. But I thought it would be interesting to look at Noach and Nimrod. So without any further ado, so I would like to begin by looking at Noach, who this individual is, examining a number of different features which he has. Oh, also, maybe I'll just apologize in advance. Tonight, I won't be able to remain after the shir. I have a Chanukat Habayit by my daughter. So if you have any questions, comments, feel free to write me at my email. Okay, so the first reference that we have to Noach is in last week's Parsha in chapter 5. And if you have my source sheet, you could see this on the first page in the right-hand column. Chapter 5, Pasuk Chavchet 28. Okay, and maybe before I actually examine the Pasuk, chapter 5 essentially gives me a genealogy of the 10 generations from Adam to Noah. And it's very interesting that there is this, what we might call template, okay, for the genealogy, but essentially it tells me the person's name, how long they lived before they had a child, okay, who that child was, okay, and I do have to say, since sometimes I get called on this, okay, in the context of the Torah, so it's a boy, okay, because it's in fact listing the line of succession, you might say. And then after it lists, after it tells me how old the person was when they had the child, it tells me how old they were subsequently, have they had many more children, and there it's boys and girls. And then it gives me the sum total of how long they lived. And that's, as I said, the template. Okay, there are two exceptions to that template. Okay, if you look at Parashat, verse 23, it says, before that, in verse 21, it says, Chanoch lived to be 65 years old, gave birth to Metushelach. And then it says, Vayithalech Chanoch et Elohim. Chanoch walked with God after he had given birth to Metushelach, 300 years, had children. And then it gives me the sum total. And then it says a second time in verse 24, Vayithalech Chanoch et Elohim, ve'einenu ki lakach oto Elohim. That Chanoch walked with God and he is no longer because God took him. Okay, so it's very interesting that Chanoch does not follow the template. And clearly the reason is because the Torah wants to highlight by repeating it that Chanoch walked with God. And it gives me this very esoteric phrase at the end. And it says he's no longer, because God in fact took him, okay, which then becomes the basis of certain midrashic comments, that Hanoch actually did not die, but he went up, right, in a fiery chariot to heaven. Okay, and for those of you who are familiar with the story by Eliyahu, okay, you could see this perhaps as being maybe reading into Hanoch what happened by Eliyahu. I'll just say parenthetically, it's very interesting that at least in the last generation, it was, or I should say the last generation and before, it was not uncommon to name a child Eliyahu Chanoch. And in fact, I have my third son is called Eliyahu Chanoch, named after my father's brother who was killed in the Holocaust. So it's very interesting that the juxtaposition of these two names is because they share the similarity that they somehow did not actually die, but that they were taken by God. In any case, Chanoch is, as I said, the exception to the template. But then we get to verse 28, Chavchet, where it says, Vayechi Lemech, and Lemech lived 82 shana, ma'at shana. He lived to be 182 years old. Vayoled ben, and he gives birth to a son. Okay, which again, if you think about it, is also very unusual because, as I said, in all the other cases, it doesn't say they gave birth to a son. It essentially tells me the name of who that son is. And here it could have very easily said, and he gave birth to Noach. But the reason for not saying that is what you have in verse 29, where it says, Vayikra et shmo Noach lemor, because here it's not only telling me what his name is, but essentially it's telling me why he was given that name. And he's given that name because Ze Yenachamenu Mima'asenu Umeitzvon Yadenu Min Ha'adama Asher Erara Hashem. This one will comfort us from our actions and from the sadness of our hands, from the earth which God has cursed. So the first thing that I want to point out is, and quite a few commentaries say this, that there's clearly well, they don't say this. What I want to point out is that there's clearly a play on words between Yenachamenu and Noach. But quite a few commentaries say that Noach actually does not come from the same root as Yenachamenu, because Yenachamenu means to comfort. And therefore, if we wanted to create a name based on that root, we should have called him Menachem, okay? But we don't. And so therefore, they tend to connect his name with the word Minucha, which means rest, okay? So that Yenachamenu is a kind of play on words over here between comforting and rest. And then the question is, what exactly is he saying? So if you look on the second page, which I gave you, so look at Rashi, where Rashi says, right, in where it says Parshanim, the commentaries, right, number 1:1, it says, Ze Yenachamenu, Yanach Mimenu will leave from us. And by the way, again, he connects it with the word Minucha, to cause to rest, Et Itzvon Yadenu, the sadness of our hands. And then he says the following, Ad shelo ba Noach, lo haya lahem klei macharisha. Prior to the time of Noach, okay, there were no plowing utensils. V'hu eichin lahem, and Noach actually prepared plowing utensils. V'hayta haaretz motzia kotzim v'dardarim kishazorim chitim, and prior to Noach, the land would give forth thorns and thistles whenever they would plant wheat. Mikilalato shel Adam harishon, as a result of the curse that was given to Adam in the aftermath of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Uvimei Noach, and in the time of Noach, nacha, it rested. Rested in the sense that it seems that there were no longer thorns and thistles which made people have to work extremely hard, which created a tremendous sense of frustration / sadness. Okay, and then Rashi says, V'zeh yenachamenu, and this is the meaning of yenachamenu. He says, Yanach mimenu. He will cause to be placed aside from us. Okay, so that Rashi isn't even connecting the idea of Yenachamenu with the idea of comforting us as much as the idea that it's going to, put certain things on hold, certain things, lay them at rest, if you will. And in this case, Noach is being called this name because he was the father of the plowshare, and as a result of that, he was the one who made working the land more tenable and took away the harshness, the sadness of working the land. Now you realize that if I connect this with Noach building the plowshare, okay, he's being given this name, right, where he wasn't exactly in a position to make a plowshare. So what you find are two very interesting commentaries by the Radak and the Sforno. If you look at number 2, the Radak says, V'amru zal, and a rabbi said, Navi gadol haya lemech. Lemech was a great prophet. Shenemar beledet beno, that Sha'amar beledet beno, that he said when his son was born, this is what he will do, which means according to what the Radak is bringing, he says, V'heach yadaza, how did he know this? Ela navi haya, he was a prophet, which means that Lemech, in effect, is prophesying that Noach is going to be the one who's going to now make life a lot easier for us, is specifically in terms of making the plowshare, so that he will be somehow mitigating the curse of the land, and even more so, the sadness, which is very much connected with that. Okay, now if you look at the next commentary that I have, the Sforno, when it says Ze Yenachamenu, he says Hitpalel. This was a prayer. This was a hope, an aspiration that he had. Not that he was a prophet, but he was hoping, may Noach bring us, okay, some sort of respite, okay? But now he then goes on to say, Shezeh Yenachem Bahamtziom Minucha Mima'asehem, that he will give us rest from their deeds. Okay, which means that the explanation which he is offering, and this in fact is not, he's not singular. There are other commentaries who say this, that the hope that he has is not that Noach will come up with some great device which is going to make it easier to till the land. The hope that he has is that Noach perhaps can bring a sense of, maybe I'll use the word normalcy, to the reality in which they live, and in particular in terms of his deeds, with the idea being that Noach, the world has perhaps deteriorated morally, as we go on to see in the continuation of the next chapter. And so there is this hope that perhaps Noach can be, as I said, this turning point maybe. Perhaps he can be a stopping point, something which can now make the world take on a different character. Okay, so I just want you to see that the first thing which I want to point out is, in chapter 5, in the list, I said to you that there are two people who are singled out. One is Chanoch, and the reason he's singled out is because he walks with God, and he dies, by the way, I didn't say earlier, but he dies what we might call prematurely. Because if you look at the list, you'll see that everybody is living pretty much in the 900s, right? That's their lifespan. And Chanoch is 365, which is appreciably less, okay? So he's singled out. But Noach is singled out in another way, okay? In that we actually give an explanation of the meaning of his name, which either is the result of some sort of prophetic statement or is an expression of hope. And the two things which come out of this is that either Noach is prophetically seen as being somebody who will somehow reverse the course of nature by virtue of creating the plowshare, or that maybe Noach will reverse the course of the world by virtue of his behavior. Okay? And we're going to come back to these 2 points afterwards. Now let's look at chapter 6. And here I want to focus on the top of page 2, chapter 6, verses 8 and 9, which specifically talk about Noach. But before I say that, in the beginning of chapter 6, we're told of a story of the sons of God who are taking the daughters of man, and God does not seem to be happy with what's going on, to the point where in verse 5, this is the top of page 2, it says, God sees that the evil of man has proliferated over the earth. Okay, and I think for those of you who heard my podcasts, so I've spoken at length about this, about how Parashat Breshit is actually very depressing, because you start off with God creating a world which consistently is described as being kitov, tov ma'od, and then the end of the parsha is that this world which was so good has now been transformed into a world where there is only evil. But what interests me right now is verse 8. In verse 8 it says, V'noach matza chen be'nei Hashem. And Noach found favor in the eyes of God. And in fact, the Vav at the beginning, V'noach, is in contrast. In the midst of a world, right, which is completely deteriorated. And by the way, if you look at the previous verse, it's also very interesting. It says at the very end of verse 7, God says he's going to wipe out all creatures, and he says, Ki nichamti. Okay? Nichamti, meaning I regret that I made them. Okay? Which is the same root as Ze Yenachamenu. So it's very interesting that on the one hand, here is God who's saying, I'm regretting that I created humanity. And maybe God is finding comfort, the same root, in Noach, and even more than comfort. Noach found favor in the eyes of God. So this is the contrast. Okay, now let's look at verse 9. It says, Eile Todot Noach, which is the beginning of our parsha. Noach, ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav, et Elohim hitalech Noach. Okay, so I just want to point out that it's very interesting, and this is a phenomenon that you see throughout the Torah, that although we've introduced someone previously, namely, in chapter 5, we were told of the birth of Noah. In chapter 6, verse 8, we're told how Noah found favor in the eyes of God, but it's as if we're starting off Parashat Noach, right? Giving Noach this whole introduction, this whole billing, okay? Because in fact, what we're doing is now not just seeing Noach as part of the larger context, but seeing Noach in his own right. And so that the focus now is on Noach. Who is he? Who is this person who has found favor in the eyes of God? And so what are we told about him? So we're told Noach is an ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav. Okay, so I want to take each one. Ish means a man, but throughout the Tanakh, very often when you refer to somebody as a man, an ish, okay, it's not a gender description, but it's actually a statement of status. An ish being somebody who is a person of status. They're a master. They're significant. So the first thing that we're told is that Noach is somebody who's, in modern Hebrew, they use the term gever, right? In other words, you're really the man, so to speak. And then we're told tzaddik and tamim. So what is tzaddik and what is tamim? And so the term tzaddik, if you look at what I have in reference under the Parshanim, number 2, okay, the Ibn Ezra. So the Ibn Ezra says, Ish tzaddik b'ma'asav. He was righteous in his actions. Tamim b'libo. Okay, and he was complete in his heart. Okay, in fact, if I now go to the next commentary, the Radak says tzaddik, shahayu ma'asav b'tzedek, his actions were with righteousness. Hefech anshe doro, the opposite of the people of his generation, shahayu anshe Hamas. They were people of violence. Okay, so that means, so now here I just want to, translate, the idea. I mean, we'll come back to the idea of Hamas a little bit later on. But for the moment, I've translated Hamas as violent. So what we're saying is that Noach is not a person of violence. But Hamas is also understood by the rabbis, and Rashi here actually says it, as being gezel, stealing. And Noach is not somebody who steals. He is a person of righteousness. Okay, now I want to define this idea of tzedek, more specifically. Tzedek has to do with the idea of that which is right. Noach is somebody who does that which is right. And in fact, I would say for the moment, he doesn't deviate to the right or left. Which means it's clear stealing is wrong. He does not steal. There are other things which are very clearly, this is what should be. I mean, if you want to say what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, right? That's something which is very clear cut. This is Noach who's tzaddik, which means that in all of the things that he does, he always is doing what we could call, quote unquote, the right thing. He's not, in fact, I'll actually refer to something else which appears in our parsha, where it says, Vatishachet haaretz lefnei ha'elohim, that the land was corrupted before God. So Noach is not somebody who's corrupted. He's not somebody who is perverting things. He's somebody who very much is straight, like a ruler, according to the book. And that's the idea of a tzaddik. Now, to go back to the Ibn Ezra, it's not just that he's a tzaddik in his actions, he's tamim in his thoughts. And I want to emphasize this, that tamim can be understood as complete. And in fact, Nachmanides actually understands it that way over here in reference number 4, because Nachmanides says that a person who's called a tzaddik is somebody who, if they are brought before the court, right, will be found innocent, and by saying he's a tzaddik tamim, what you're saying is he is completely innocent. In no way can Noach be found guilty of having done anything wrong. But I'm actually more interested in the Ibn Ezra and more interested in the explanation of tamim as not being complete, but innocent. And the idea being that it's not only that Noach does the right thing, but Noach, in fact, does it for the right reason. He's somebody who in the end is what we might call pure of heart. He has no ulterior motive, right? He's doing it because it's the right thing to do. And although I did not bring this here, But if you were to actually then go on to look at the opening chapters of the Parsha, we really get to see this idea of Noach being a tzaddik, and I want to emphasize this now, in that when God gives him the instructions to build the ark, everything associated with building the ark, at various points it says, and Noach did exactly as God had commanded him to do. Okay, which means that in fact that's Noach. If Noach is told to do X, then there are no shenanigans. Okay, he doesn't come up with all kinds of, as they say in yeshiva, chakirot, all kinds of pilpul. No, you're told to do something, then you just go and do it, and you do it to the end. That's Noach. That's tzaddik. And the other element is that Noach is tamim. So, if we were to stop here and we were to kind of summarize for a moment, we'd say, so what is it that characterizes Noach? Noach, in fact, is somebody who is in a completely different place from what seems to be the zeitgeist of his generation. He's somebody who is a tzaddik. He's somebody who is tamim. Whereas everybody around him, or the whole milieu, seems to be corrupted. It seems to be filled with violence. That's not Noach. Noach is somebody who, in fact, is a person of stature. He finds favor in the eyes of God. And if I then add the very last thing which we have in Pasuk Tet, Et Elohim hitalech Noach. Noach walks with God. Okay, and here I think it's important to go back to what I mentioned earlier. Chanoch was also described as walking with God twice. But Chanoch, as we said, was taken prematurely by God. Noach lives to a ripe old age of 950 years. And it seems that beyond walking with God, he has these other features. He's a tzaddik, he's a tamim. And here I also want to throw in one last comment, which for those of you who have heard my podcasts, it says tzaddik tamim haya bidorotav, in his generations, and Noah spanned quite a few generations. Okay, for those of you who are familiar with Rashi, so Rashi brings the rabbinic comment that says, well, in his generations, he was righteous, but had he been in the generation of Abraham, okay, he would not have been considered to be anything special, which means that you kind of want to qualify his being, righteous and pure, like it's contextually, right? Given the framework that he's living in, okay, so, he stands out a cut above the rest. But had he been in a different environment, he wouldn't be anybody special. So in a podcast, I mentioned that I think that the explanation over here, okay, is that, yeah, I know, Richard, that Rashi says that if he was righteous even here, how much more so would have been in the time of Abraham, right? That's one opinion that you have in the Gemara. But what I want to say is that by saying he was righteous in his generations, that it's saying Noach is consistent. No matter what is going on around him, right? He has this consistency. He has principles. He sticks to those principles no matter what, okay? Which is a tremendous statement that Noach is not swayed in any way by the winds that are blowing around him. He knows who he is. He knows what should be done. And he will continuously, consistently do that. Okay. Now, everything which I've described is Noach before the flood. But then there's Noach after the flood. And actually, I didn't bring this here, but it seems that there's a slight hint immediately after the flood that Noah doesn't do what God asked him to do. Because originally, when they went on the boat, God said that the men and women should be separated. The men go separately, the women go separately. You can check this out. We won't do this right now. On the other hand, when the time came to actually come off the boat, to disembark, so God said that they should come off the boat as couples. And Noah didn't do that. It seems to be that when they came off the boat, they came off the boat the same way they went on the boat. So it's perhaps the first time where it does not say, and Noah did as God told him. And you get a slight hint that Noah is not just now following what God said. But what I wanted to look at is actually what appears in chapter 9. Okay? And what we're told of is an initiative that Noah takes, which is actually the last picture that we have of Noah. And it's not exactly to his credit. So if you look at chapter 9, verse 20, Pasuk Chaf, it says, Vayachal Noach ish adama, and Noach, the man of the earth, begins, Vayita Karem, and he plants a vineyard. Vayesh min hayayim vayishkar, and he drinks from the wine and he gets drunk. Vayitkal betoch ahalo, and he is uncovered, exposed in his tent. Okay, now, when I'm interested in looking, the first thing, since as it connects also with things we discussed last week, is Noach is described as an ish adama, a man of the earth. Now, last week, I spoke a number of times about how God said to Adam, or initially it says, Va'adam ayin, and there's no man, la'avod, to serve the earth. And then God, when he sends Adam out of the garden, he sends him out, la'avod et ha'adama asher lukach misham, to serve the earth. Cain is described as an oved adama, someone who serves the earth. But Noach is an ish adama. Now, what does it mean to be an ish adama? So, according to the first thing which I want to point out is that an ish adama means a man of the earth, and as I mentioned to you earlier, it means a man of stature. And therefore, there are quite a few commentaries who say a man of the earth means a master of the earth. And there are some commentaries who say that it's this verse which is perhaps the hint to what the rabbis said, that Noach invented the plowshare. And now is when Noach is actually, putting it into practice, that here he is tilling the earth and showing his mastery over the earth. Okay, that's one explanation. There's a second explanation which appears in a number of commentaries, which has nothing to do with the plowshare, but that Noach's mastery of the earth is in the fact that he plants a vineyard, and the fact that he produces wine, which means that up to this point in time, there was no wine in the world. There were grapes. What Noach is doing is, in fact, showing or bringing out the full potential that the earth has to offer. Right? And if you think about it, I mentioned this last week, when God curses the land, but there's also a kind of built-in blessing. God says, by the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread, but bread is something which takes a lot of invention, a lot of ingenuity to create, which means that you're not just eating grains that come out of the ground, you're actually going to know, or you'll learn how to process in order to make it something which is immeasurably better, okay, and more satisfying. And so what happens with Adam, right, in terms of bread, and that's part of the curse slash blessing which God gives him, by Noach is now happening with wine, except that God did not tell him anything about wine. This is his being an ish adamah, okay? Now, I'd also like to add that it's kind of very striking that, in other words, that at least the thing which we're really highlighting is this idea of the wine. And it might be that the Torah wants to say that this is like the first, this is the precedent. It's not that he didn't plant other things, but this is the first time where we've created wine. And as we know from Psalms and otherwise, the yain yisamach levav enosh, wine is something which makes you happy. And maybe at this point, there's a need to bring, quote unquote, happiness into the world. And maybe this is also a part of how Noach is going to somehow mitigate the sadness, because he's going to actually bring into the world something that fills us with joy. But as we see in the continuation of the story, it does not turn out well, because Noach doesn't know how to handle his liquor, so to speak, and then he becomes exposed. And perhaps what's even more significant to us is, let's look at 24 and 25. When Noach wakes up from his wine, he knows what his younger son had done to him. And it's not so clear, okay, at the very least, the younger son, right, had seen Noach exposed in his tent. And then verse 25, which is very important, Vayomer Arur Kna'an, he says, "Cursed be Kna'an, Eved Avadim Yele Echav, a slave of slaves he will be to his brothers." And then he says, Vayomer Baruch Hashem Elohei Shem, V'hi Kna'an Eved Lamo. He blesses the God of Shem and says, may Kna'an be a servant to him. And then a second time, Yaft Elokim liyefet, v'yishkom b'yaholei Shem, v'yichnan eved lamo. Now, almost all the commentaries say that in verse 25, when it says that cursed is Kna'an, a slave of slaves he will be to his brothers. Who are his brothers? So they say his brothers are the children of Ham, okay? Which means that in effect, Canaan is not only a slave to Shem and to Yefet, but he's also a slave to Ham. There's a very interesting disagreement among commentaries as to whether it's only Kna'an who's going to be a slave, or whether by implication, it's actually all the children of Ham who are meant to be slaves. And for the moment, I'd like to go by that opinion, which says that in fact, Noach is actually saying that all of the descendants of Ham will be slaves. And that's why when it says in verse 25, Eved avadim yele echav, a slave of slaves, it means that his brothers who are also going to be slaves, but he will be even one step lower. He will be a slave to a slave, as opposed to them who will be slaves to maybe Shem, maybe Yefet. Okay? So what I want to bring out over here is, by the way, this is the last picture we have of Noach. And there are two parts to this which are very, very problematic. One part of it is that Noach curses his son, in this case his grandson, but it might be also his son, Ham, because he's talking about all of his progeny, and which we don't find earlier. Okay, I mean, we do find it in the case of Cain, that God curses Cain, but initially God refrains from cursing someone. And it's just very striking that here it's Noach. And by the way, I also want to say we actually never find Noah speaking. If you were to check our parsha, he never talks. Okay, he does a lot of different things. This is perhaps the first thing and the last thing which he says. And it's interesting that the first thing that comes out of his mouth is arur, cursed. And the second thing is that in effect, what Noah is doing is perhaps creating or invoking the institution of slavery. The idea that one brother will rule over the other. Okay, and I don't have to elaborate on the problematics of that. So that with all of the billing which we had of Noah, about how Noah found favor and he was righteous, he was complete, and he was. And ultimately, he actually is the one who saves humanity, right? Because he saves a remnant that can then repopulate the world. He is the second father of humanity. But at the same time, here is Noah, who as an Ish Adamah wanted to bring perhaps more joy into the world, more sophistication into the world. And then because he wasn't able to handle it properly, it resulted in curse. It resulted in, as I said, the institution of slavery. So now this actually becomes a segue to what we find later on in the Parsha. And this is what we find by Nimrod. So now if we go back to the first page, to the verses that we have, okay, regarding Nimrod. So the first time we encounter Nimrod is in chapter 10. And what I'd like to point out is chapter 10, maybe let's look at even the opening verse. It says, Ve'ele toldot b'nei Noach. These are the progeny of the sons of Noach, Shem, Cham, Vayafet. Vayivaldu lahem banim achar hamabul. And there were children born to them after the flood. Now, I purposely brought this whole chapter, okay, because what we're doing is now giving you a whole listing of all of the descendants of Noah who came out after the flood. And we even tell you, the numbers of how many they are. And what's fascinating is that this listing in chapter 10 is essentially giving me the development of what we would call today nation states, which means it's describing to me how different nations evolved. And in fact, all the people who are mentioned in this list all went on to become separate nations. And for those of you, and it tells me how they developed, right? They started out as being what we would call today extended families, chamulot, who then settled in particular areas, who developed their own language, developed their own culture. And if you actually add up the numbers, you'll see that we have a listing of 70. And this becomes the basis of what the rabbis say, that there are 70 nations of the world, which means that what we have in chapter 10 are essentially the seeds for what are known as the 70 nations of the world. And if you look at it, and in certain ways it's kind of a little bit parallel to chapter 5 that we began with, it's like, again, a general template that you have, right? In other words, Yefed had these sons, okay? And then Cham had these sons, and Shem had these sons. And then they had other sons, right? Grandchildren. And then it gives me the sum total of how many there were. And in the midst, there's something which stands out, which doesn't fit the template. And that's what I have highlighted in verse 8 and 9. In verse 8 and 9, it says, and Cush, who is the eldest son of Cham, Cush yaladet Nimrod. He begat Nimrod. Hu hechel, he began liot gibor ba'aretz, to be a mighty man in the land. Hu haya gibor tzayid lifnei Hashem, he was a mighty hunter before God. Al ken yamer, therefore it is said, kin Nimrod, like, is there anyone like Nimrod, gibor tzayid lifnei Hashem, right? A mighty hunter before God. And then the last thing we're told is, Patihi reshit mamlachto Bavel. And the beginning of his kingdom was in Babylonia, ve'erech va'akad v'chalnei, be'eret Shinar, in the land of Shinar. So I would like to actually begin with a comment. Well, let me perhaps begin with. Wait, let me just find it for 1 second. It always happens when you're looking for something. Okay, I'm going to find exactly who says this. Maybe some of you who are speed readers, you can find it ahead of me. But one of the commentaries, I'm just not finding it right now, says that Nimrod is actually different from everyone else who's mentioned on this, in that Nimrod was actually, because he actually he didn't create a nation. Here it's in the Sforno. If you look at number 8, right on page 3, the Sforno says, V'chush yaladet Nimrod, b'toch otam shenikra'im al shmo, among all those who are listed after Cush, Yalad ish prati, he gave birth to a private individual, mifursam ligibor, okay, who was well known as a mighty man. But the idea of him being an ish prati is that he did not go on to become a nation. He was an individual, which means everyone else who's mentioned in the list is not just mentioned because he was a son of, but because he ultimately became the founder of a nation. Nimrod did not become the founder of a nation. On the other hand, it's ironic that Nimrod is the first person who is referred to as having a kingdom. And by implication, he is the first who is a king, which means he's a king, but he's not necessarily founding a nation. Now, I'd like to look at number 2 of the Ibn Ezra, which is really very interesting. The Ibn Ezra says, if you look at it, Nimrod, al tevakesh tam l'chol hashemot. Don't look for a reason behind the names. Im lo nichtav. If the reason wasn't written, if it wasn't given. Okay, sorry, I should turn off my phone. Okay, so, and then he says, let me continue reading. He began to show the superiority of people over the animals, how they were able to control the animals, because he was a mighty hunter. And then he says, V'tam lifnei Hashem, and the meaning that he was a gibor tzayid before God, shaya bonem mizbechot. He built altars, ma'aleh otam achayot, olal Hashem, and he would take those animals that he had captured, bring them up as an offering to God. V'zeh derech hapshat, and that's the simple meaning of the text. V'hadrash derech acheret, and the drash has another way. Okay. Now, if you look at Nachmanides, the Ramban, number 5, look at the third line. He says, V'Rabbeinu Avraham Piresh, Hefech ha'inyan al derech pshito. He explained the opposite of the matter according to his pshat, right, approach. Ki hu echel yot gibor lachayot latzudeltam. That right, and I'm not going to translate because he's just quoting him. Upiresh lefnei Hashem shaya bonem mizbechot malet hachayot lo'olah lefnei Hashem ve'ein dvarav nir'in. And he does not, his words do not seem to be what should be. V'hinehu matzdik rasha. He is, in fact, okay, making an evil person into someone who is righteous or vindicating an evil person. Ki rabotenu yadu risho b'kabbalah. Because the rabbis knew of the evil of Nimrod according to a tradition. Which means, now, by the way, this is what the Ramban says, and it's based on the rabbinic understanding. And in fact, this seems to be the general approach taken by the overwhelming majority of commentaries who say that Nimrod was an evil individual. And that, in fact, in no way should Nimrod be seen as being somebody who was actually hunting and then offering these things to God, a pious individual serving God through this, occupation of hunting. All of his prowess was then dedicated to the altar of God. And the Ramban is very upset with the Ibn Ezra. He says, that here you are. How can you be vindicating such an evil individual? I just want to point out, and I'm not going to get into a whole discussion of this right now, but some of you, this is something you could look up on your own. There are quite a few biblical scholars who actually want to connect or identify Nimrod with Hammurabi, because he lived at the same time. In other words, if you make the various calculations, it would seem that they were living at the same period of time in the same area. And if you do that, then we all know of the Hammurabi Code, and it might, be that maybe the Ibn Ezra might have even, according to the Pshat, been inclined that way to say, you know what, maybe he wasn't such a bad guy. Maybe he actually, had a lot of good things going for him. That approach is generally not the approach which is taken by traditional scholars. And what I'd like to do is look at the second approach, as I said, the traditional one, in terms of how it emerges from the text, at least. So let's look at as I said, what are we told of Nimrod? Okay, so the point which is emphasized a number of times is Nimrod is a gibor. Okay, now, up to this point, the term gibor in the Chumash did not have a positive connotation. And in fact, if you look, right, at the psukim that I gave you about Noach, right, in the beginning of chapter 6, right, this is the very top of the second page, when it talks about the sons of God and the daughters of man, okay, who are having children, it says, Hema hagiborim, these are the mighty people, Asher me'olam, Anshe Hashem, the people with a name. And then the very next verse is Vayar Hashem ki rabba ra'at adam ba'aretz. Okay, so it seems that, in other words, this phenomenon of the Giborim who have a name, okay, and everything that surrounds them was not seen in a positive light by God. Which means that already the fact that Nimrod is described as being a Gibor, okay, at least from what we saw earlier, is problematic. Now, what the Ibn Ezra dismissed, and which quite a few commentaries comment on, is his name. What what's his name? His name is Nimrod. Nimrod means let us rebel. Okay, and the Ibn Ezra says, don't start, giving all kinds of, drashot on a person's name. If the Torah doesn't tell you what it means, so just leave it, okay? Now, the fact of the matter is, right, we know from many places in the Torah that, in other words, that names do have significance. And I would even venture to say that even today, right, in other words, what you name someone has significance, whatever it might be that you attach to it. Now, Nimrod clearly is related to the word mered, which means to rebel. So even though the Torah didn't explain, like, what's the significance of the name, and even though, okay, whoever gave him his name, right, Cush, okay, I wouldn't necessarily say he had prophetic vision, right, and he was, or what I might say, and this is what I'd like to get to is, but maybe it was aspirational. And what do I mean by being aspirational? Because Nimrod is the first king. And it could very well be that Cush, right, and altogether the line of Ham, are not happy campers about the fact that they have been destined to be slaves. And so therefore, here is Nimrod. He is the one who's trying to change the course of that, which means he is not willing to accept his faith. He's fighting against it. When Nimrod sets up his kingdom, right? And again, if you have a kingdom and you have a king, that implies that you have servants. And here I might say not only servants, but maybe slaves. Okay, who are the members of his kingdom? Well, it turns out that Ashur, if you look at chapter 10, seems to actually be the area, should be the area of the descendants of Shem. The area of the descendants of Ham, right, is Africa. So even, and if you were to look at this, it's kind of this kind of division that Yefet is Europe, okay, Shem is what we would call today the Middle East, okay, Near East, and that Ham is Africa. So what's Nimrod doing there? So what I would like to say is that Nimrod is there because we're describing, right, when we talk about the development of the different nations, okay, that's something which took a period of time. It didn't happen overnight. And initially, with the development of time that I see my connection is unstable. It was only after a period of time that they then spread out, which means that in fact Nimrod, okay, may have actually been living together with the children of Yefet, the children of Shem, and the people who are in his kingdom are not just his people, so to speak, from his lineage, but his cousins, the cousins who were supposed to be the rulers. So that on that level, Nimrod, okay, are people hearing me? Just stick up your hand or finger just to show that you're hearing me. Are people hearing me? Yes? Okay, thank you. So therefore, what Nimrod in effect is doing is rebelling. Therefore, what I want to say is that on a certain level, it could very well be that the last thing which Noach does, which is to curse his son, in a certain sense, maybe set the stage for Nimrod coming on the scene. Now, Nimrod, according to the various rabbinic understandings, is not only rebelling against the fact that he doesn't want to be a slave, but ultimately is rebelling against God. And when it says that Nimrod is a mighty man, lifnei Hashem, and here there's a quite a disagreement among commentaries as what that means. You saw the Ibn Ezra. There are various commentaries who want to say that Nimrod actually, Lifnei Hashem doesn't mean he was in service of God, but Lifnei Hashem is a way of just highlighting how mighty he was. But since my time is running out, I just want to point out two comments about this idea of Lifnei Hashem. If you look at page number 3, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, he says the following. Nimrod hechel liot gibor tzayit. Nimrod began, okay, yes, it could be in God's face. I didn't see who said that. Nimrod began being a mighty hunter, tzayit, and a hunter. Hu haya gibor latzud bnei adam. He was mighty in hunting people. Hu ziveg, he combined alimut, violence, im orma, with cunning, with trickery. Kedei lilkod et habriot letzorech tokniotav, in order to ensnare people, okay, for his agenda, so to speak. So here I want to point out another thing, which also might be the basis of what the rabbis say, that in fact, it's not just he was a gibor, but he's described as a gibor tzayid. Tzayid is a hunter. And later on, we also see tzayid is not necessarily something which is complementary. Okay, and we're not going to get to this, but Esav, the son of Yaakov, is also a gibor tzayid. What I'd like to say is that being a tzayad, being a hunter, is the polar opposite of how Noach is described as being tamim. If Noach is innocent, naive, a straight shooter, Nimrod is a manipulator. And Nimrod knows how to manipulate a situation. There's actually a fascinating comment which says that Nimrod actually was not such a mighty hunter. If you look at the last reference that I have, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, look at, this is the middle, the line which starts Shenemar, v'chush yaladet Nimrod. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Hakutonet she'asa kadosh baruch hu la'adam u'lishto. The garments, the cloaks which God had made for Adam and Eve in the aftermath of the expulsion from the garden, or Haita imam bateva, was taken presumably by Noach into the ark. And when they embarked from the ark, Lekacha Cham ben Noach, Cham, the son of Noach, took it, and Vehinchilal and Nimrod, and he gave it as an inheritance to Nimrod. When Nimrod would wear it, all types of animals would come and fall before him. Kisfurim, and people thought shehu mikoach gevurato, because he was mighty. Lefichach, and therefore him lichuhu aleim, they made him into a king. But the implication is it really had nothing to do with his actual might, which means that there is this midrash which says that the cloaks which God gave Adam and Eve, kotnot or, skin clothes, was actually supposed to differentiate people from animals and in fact impose the fear of people upon animals. And those garments somehow made their way to Nimrod. And when Nimrod wore them, so it had this we might say, magical effect on the animals, and he was able to subdue them, but not because he was really a mighty individual, okay, but because he knew to wear the right clothes, so to speak, which means from beginning to end, Nimrod was a manipulator. And essentially what the Midrash is saying, he was manipulating people, and he did it by showing his prowess, so to speak, over the animals. That's how he was able to gain his control of people. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch actually goes on and says something, and I'll end with this. If you go back to page 3, number 9, he says that on the second line after the 3 dots, he says, Vata, and now, Nimrod hechel l'shabed et habriot. Nimrod began to subjugate people, u'ledakei otam, and to oppress them, b'shem Hashem, in the name of God. U'haya rishon, he was the first, shenitzel shem shamayim l'ra'ah, that exploited God's name for evil. U'hisva, he masked et ha'aritzut, his tyranny, bihilat kodesh, in this halo of holiness, shel ratzon Hashem, as the will of God. The darash b'shem Hashem, and he demanded in the name of God, hakara b'shiltono, recognition of his rule, which means, according to Rabbi Hirsch, when it says Nimrod was a gibor tzayid lifnei Hashem, he was this mighty hunter before God. It's not only that he would bring these things up as an offering to God, but he would invoke God's name as the basis for justifying his rule. And in effect, Nimrod was the person who essentially exercised tyrannical rule in the name of God. And this is his tzayid. This is how he is cunning. So I just want to end up with this point that, at least according to this understanding, here we have these 2 personalities. We have Noach, who found favor in the eyes of God. Noach, who in fact was the faithful servant of God, who was an ish tzaddik, tamim, who was a straight shooter, who did whatever God wanted him to do. Unfortunately, at the end of his life, there was an incident which in the end led him to do something, which was a grave error, cursing his son, creating, right, in a sense, the institution of slavery. And it may very well be that that's what spawned the emergence of a Nimrod who rebelled against that, but not only against that, but in many ways rebelled against everything which Noah stood for in terms of the idea of walking with God, serving with God, and in fact, twisted it on its head. In fact, used God to justify his self-aggrandizement. I just want to end with the last comment, okay? Yes, the parsha started with good, but ended with bad, yes. Although the very end of the parsha has to do with Abraham, so it does end on a more positive note. In any case, I just want to point out the very last thing. When we spoke about the mighty people, at the end of Parashat Bereshit, we said, Heima HaGiborim, and I read it earlier, but I didn't. Anshe Hashem, the men with the name. Now, in chapter 11, the very next story after we're told about Nimrod in chapter 10, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And in that story, it's very interesting that the rabbis, and you can see that in the midrash that I brought at the end, see Nimrod as being the driving force behind it. But it's fascinating, Nimrod is never mentioned in the story. What's also very interesting is a major impetus to build the tower was to make for us a name. It's fascinating that in the end, there is no name which is made. And in the end, Nimrod's name does not appear. Food for thought. We'll continue next week. Next week, I will actually be launching from New York City. So I hope we won't have any technical difficulties, but I look forward to seeing you next week. And I'm sorry I can't remain. Any comments, questions, feel free to contact me on my email.
Chodesh Tov, l'siyah tova.
Thank you.